two arguments and what I call the queries, so something I'm still not sure about, but I'd like to look into. One of them, the first one is very black letter law, kind of. It's not novel in any sense, but we have to set it at the grounds for our discussion, for our legal discussion, which is that victims of external aggressions, meaning victims of war from another country, are not covered by the 1951 Refugee Convention, by its definition. So this is the starting point, which is somewhat paradoxical to most of us. Most of us think this is almost oxymoronic, that these are refugees, but what I've tried to show, and this is really black letter refugee law, is that they are not covered by the regular European or 1951 Convention. Second argument is that Europe, or maybe the West even, despite the first point, is many times giving special regard to European refugees and refugees in the broad sense. So not only ones who are really fit the 1951 Convention. So in that sense, if you are a victim of war, you might as well be European than non-European. So there's something to begin with. You start from a worse starting point because you're not considered a refugee, but it's better if you're European in that scenario. And the third point, which is more of a query that I started thinking about really when I made this presentation, is are we moving back from a general normative definition of refugee to what used to be before the 51 Convention, something more of an ad hoc recognition of refugees. So are we going back there? Okay, so I'll start with the black letter law. This is the definition of a refugee of the 51 Convention. It has two subparagraphs. The first subparagraph is really not relevant today because I don't think any refugees of this subparagraph are still alive, but it's important because we talk historically. So to show the historical roots, these are people who have been considered refugee under specific arrangements between in the 20s and the 30s and until the 40s, basically under the League of Nations between two world wars. Really, at the time, there was not one general normative definition of refugee. What happened is that in retrospect, from time to time, the League of Nations decided, for example, in the first arrangement of 12 May 1926, the League of Nations understood that Russian refugees from the Bolshevik Revolution, so already almost a decade-old refugees, and also Armenian refugees from several years before, are not going to disappear, are not going back to their countries, and and the international community should give them some kind of protection, basically identity papers, and allowing them to stay in the countries where they ended up in. So, and there are several other arrangements, and the idea was then it's always in retrospect, so we're not defining them to begin with as refugees, but we look backwards, and it's very ad hoc. So these Russian people would be recognized as refugees and get several rights. These Armenian people, these Assyrians, most of them in Europe, not only, but you should remember that we are still in the era of colonization of the Middle East, so even if it's non-European countries, they're in the region where European colonies are located. This kind of starts to touch on my point that Europe really cared mostly about Europe, but we'll get to that. But then the novelty of the 1951 Convention, which was a novelty in progress, so it's not in one strike, but in 1951 basically we have a partly normative general definition because of the beginning, as a result of events occurring before January 1st, 1951, and owing to a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinions, we have here a normative definition, well-founded fear of persecution on account of one of 5 grounds. It's not completely normative because it still looks backwards. It says for events occurring before January 1st, 51, but it was the beginning of a normative definition, which later on we'll see became the definition striking down the words as a result of events occurring before January 1st, 51. But to begin with, we're still in 1951. We had limitations of time and place. The limitation of time really, obviously, things happening before 51. It's really the beginning of my claim, Europeans caring mainly about Europeans. It's really at the end of World War II, we have more than, we still argue about the numbers, but obviously more than 10 million refugees scattered around Europe. The international community, mainly with the prevailing West, the prevailing parties, the United States, France, Great Britain, Russia, etc., wanting to solve this problem of Europe, where there are so many millions of refugees are scattered, and therefore limiting the time for refugeehood before 51, and also countries could also opt to narrow the scope of their protection only to European refugees. So not only before 51, a country could also decide that it wishes to protect only European refugees. For example, Turkey decided to do so, and still this is why we'll see later on the temporal and geographic limitations are being drawn down, but since Turkey to begin with narrowed its obligation only to Europeans, it is still obliged only to them. Therefore, when the Syrians came in the 21st century, they said, well, the last time I checked, they're not Europeans, so I don't have any obligations under the Refugee Convention. But anyways, let's move on. Still before January 1st, 1951, we had some other historical occurrences which ended up with many refugees. For example, India, Pakistan, for example, North Korea, South Korea in the beginning of the 50s, and Palestine, of course. So we see that the convention even took care of at least partly of that. So the convention also included Article 1D, which says that the convention shall not apply to persons who are at present receiving from organs or agencies other than UNHCR protection assistance. At the time, there were mainly two agencies. One is the Agency for North Korea, and the second, UNRWA for Palestine, which still exists till today. So that's another, I think, proof that the international community wanted to leave out some non-European refugees. Especially historians claim that the United States viewed these two spots as geopolitically important to eat because of physical or ideological conquest of communist Russia. At the time, it's already the height of the Cold War, and wanted to have special concern for these communities, and they are excluded from the Refugee Convention. If we move later on, because we wanted to talk a bit about history here, so in 1958, again a European crisis. We have within several days invasion of Russia, then it's the Soviet Union, and about 2,100 Hungarians, intellectuals, students, etc. flee within several days, mainly to Austria. And that's the first time that Europe is facing again a large-scale refugeehood. And at the time, if you remember, the Refugee Convention talked still about limiting its scope to pre-51 refugees. But somehow, and Gil Losher talks about it, the Hungarian Revolution and the coming of age of UNHCR. So it was the first time, if you like, that the United Nations High Commission for Refugees had this very important role. Despite the fact that the convention was not applicable, the UNHCR was still there by the statute of UNHCR and was asked to help, and managed politically to be helpful in a way that was seemed somewhat objective to both sides. So it managed to take most of the refugees from Austria and resettle them in other Western countries which were happy to accept them, Australia, the United States, etc. I'm opening a parenthesis. Of course, we know that there's a mixture of law and politics and refugee law. For example, the United States was very happy to accept these Hungarian refugees. Until the year of 1968, 99% of refugees that America accepted were from communist countries. It was their way of showing how they are the El Dorado, these people want to flee from the East and come to the West. So This was played very well to America, but also about 20,000 minors, because they were minors, were returned to their parents in Hungary. So in this sense, both sides were kind of getting something from UNHCR, and that's the one point that historians such as Gindlosha says this is when UNHCR got its legitimacy again, and the international community started to understand that refugeehood is not going anywhere, unfortunately. Refugees still persist. And even in Europe, there might be other occurrences where we'll need this international body. And some claim that this is one of the reasons that led to the Protocol of 1967, which is the point in time where the international community agrees to delete the words before January 1st, 51, and delete the words Europe only, unless the country to begin with, such as Turkey, but there are very few of them, decided to limit its obligation only to European refugees. Okay, so that's kind of the general background. So we see how the convention really came out of a European tragedy, really World War II, and especially the Jewish Holocaust, and how it was framed to deal with miseries, especially characterized by World War II. First of all, we talk about persecution. So it's not every kind of human misery. The idea being that my country, I was a citizen persecuted by my own government, and the coming of age of the idea that a country has a responsibility towards its citizens. It's a relatively novel idea at the point that there's fiduciary duties are going both ways. A government is owing me as a citizen protection, and of course not to persecute me. And if my government doesn't do so, then another government is going to be what the British House of Law called a surrogacy state. So because I should get this protection in my own country is not giving me this protection, I will get this protection for another country. But it's only because the idea was the breach of fiduciary duty of my government, victims of poverty or hunger, for example, are left out, because it's not something that my government is doing to me intentionally. I'm kind of a victim of something that was not human, and therefore I'm not considered to be a refugee by the convention. And not only should I be persecuted, I should be persecuted on account of one of 5 reasons. So basically because of my political opinion, or my race, or my religion. And if we look at persons left outside of the Refugee Convention, for example, we have victims of external aggression. Because if I'm a victim, if Russia is bombing Ukraine, first of all, it's not my government who's persecuting me. So I can't say that I need a substitute government because my government is not doing a good, is acting against me. Actually, the Ukrainian government is trying to protect Ukrainians in vain, or partly in vain, but trying. And second of all, it's indiscriminate indiscriminate misfortune. So I'm not being targeted by the missiles just because I'm Catholic or Protestant or Jewish or part of this ethnic community or another ethnic community. It's just indiscriminately targeting all Ukrainians. And for that reason, again, paradoxically, some of us might say, Ukrainian refugees are not considered to be refugees by the 1951 Convention. Okay? They might be, as lawyers, we can try to be creative, and we say, well, specifically in Lugansk, and whatever, if I'm being persecuted there because I'm Ukrainian, but I'm not Russian speaking, okay, maybe. We can try and give some specific legal arguments for these people. But if we talk the whole of Ukraine, and just by the mere bombing, these people supposedly do not fall under the definition. We have Solberg and his mates writing about 3 types of refugees, sociological refugees, not legal refugees, the activist, the target, and the victim, and basically only the activist and the target are covered by the 1951 convention, and the mere victim is not covered by it. Of course, we have some regional instruments that try to expand the definition. One of them is the Organization of African Unity's Convention of '69. They said that they have a two-clause definition of refugee. The first clause is exactly the 1951 convention, so a person owing a wealth, who has a well-founded fear of persecution on account on race, and then the second paragraph says the term refugee shall also apply to every person who, owing to external aggression, occupation, foreign domination, or events seriously disturbing public order, is outside, because of this, is deemed to be outside of his country, etc. And we have a similar thing in Latin America, the Cartagena Declaration. So we see how two different regions in the world decided to expand this definition, not in Europe and not the general 1951 convention. Now, of course, just to finish the very black letter law legal arguments, we have complementary protection or subsidiary protection, which might cover also Ukrainian refugees. It's more limited because it doesn't give you a full set of rights like the Refugee Convention, and basically the main protection is non-refoulement. It's not as good a protection as the protection given to refugees under international law, and I can expand on that in the Q&A session. Now, what happens in Europe these days, and what was the beginning of this shift? An interesting shift, specifically in Europe, is in 2001. In 2001, the EU passes the Temporary Protection Directive. This directive was promulgated because of the war in Yugoslavia. And basically, the European Union says we need to have some kind of an instrument in case for the next time that we have mass influx. So it's interesting because it came to the word because of a European crisis. And as I'll show you in a second, it was activated the first time in the EU because of a European crisis, meaning the Russia-Ukraine war. So the idea of the Temporary Protection Directive is that once a specific body, the Commission, I don't remember which exactly organ of the EU, advises another body, and at the end of the day, this other body decides that there is a mass influx of immigrants, not being defined as refugees under the 51 Convention, so much more broadly, as any person who has a serious risk, etc., etc. So basically two main criteria. One of them is mass influx, so it's a big number of people within a short period of time. And the second is that they have serious danger in their own country. They'll get some kind of a temporary protection, but this temporary protection is quite wide. It's limited in time, so it's 1 year, but it can be extended without a specific endpoint. And you get most of the rights. And according to this directive, you can have also either a limited scope of rights, which will not include moving within EU country, or a more broad set of rights, which will allow you that as well. So the first time that the directive was activated was in 2022. You'll see that the Russian invasion was in 24th of February, and already in the 4th of March, so it's I think maybe 2 weeks time, there was already a decision by the relevant organs of the EU for the first time to activate this directive, and basically Ukrainian refugees enjoy a relatively serious protection in all EU countries. So not only did the EU Commission decided to activate this directive, it also decided to activate it as broadly as possible to allow further movement within the countries. Again, right to employment, right to most, if not all, social benefits, right to bring family members as well. So we see on the one hand that there is the Ukrainian refugees, maybe paradoxically to begin with, are not covered by the 1951 convention, but we see that at least in Europe there was a very quick response by the EU organs to allow serious protection of these people. Now, on the one hand, of course, we're very happy. We think that's very apt and proper to allow these Ukrainians refugees protection across Europe, and all people for human rights protection are supportive of this. On the other hand, of course, a question arises: how come it wasn't activated before? It wasn't activated when there were, mass influx of Syrians coming in boats from Libya to Italy and Greece. It wasn't activated when there was a mass influx of Afghans and Iraqi refugees. So the more critical response to this is, white Europe is giving refuge to other white Europeans. And I leave it to each person to think what he or she thinks about this criticism. I'll end up, this is really the end of my talk, with the query: are we really going back to ad hoc and retroactive decisions? So unlike if the move was in 1951, and especially in 1967, to leave these ad hoc retroactive, which are also much more easily politically motivated, because then if there's a political, body, be it the UN, the League of Nations, the UN, or the EU, or the US government, deciding retroactively if these people are considered to be refugees, after we understand exactly how many people they are, and after a few years when you see when they're scattered, and maybe we can cherry pick some of them. The move was to a general normative definition, and now it seems with the Ukrainian refugees we're going back. So we see in Europe this TP directive being activated for the first time for specific people, Ukrainians. And we see, for example, other countries more remote, the United States, saying they're not, we'll have a numerical restriction, we'll accept up to 180,000, which is not something which you can find in the Refugee Convention. We don't have numerical quotas. We might criticize that as well. We don't have also burden sharing or liability sharing in the Refugee Convention. That's a big problem. But here we see America saying we'll give to Ukrainians up to this number. And we see also now in the United States, something that also the Minister Shaked, who gave us very many presents the past few weeks to immigrants in Israel, also tried to do the same thing, to say that you don't just, a refugee, you don't ask him to apply before he leaves his country. The idea is that once he's in your territory, even in the airport, he can ask for asylum. And the Americans now say what Israel tried to do the same is, you, dear Ukrainian refugee, apply first from abroad before you come register. In Israel, they wanted the Ukrainian refugee to register in a Ministry of Foreign Affairs website. And once we allow you in, you can get in, and we'll have a numerical restriction. In Israel, it didn't work out because the Supreme Court struck it down, but for very formal reasons. It didn't say anything about the problemcy of the idea itself. It said, formally, Israel has a bilateral agreement with a visa waiver agreement with Ukraine. This is still in force. This agreement was also became part of Israeli law because there was a Knesset, some kind of a channel to one of the Knesset committees, and it's part of the entry into Israel law, and therefore you cannot ask for registration because it's basically like asking for a visa. It's the same thing as asking for a visa, but if you want to waive this, go to the Knesset to waive. So the idea was exactly very, very formal. And in the United States, now trying to do the same thing, so I've heard, and there's a numerical restriction. So my question, and this is where I'll end my talk, is are we going back, and what will be the price of this change of the way we treat refugees worldwide?
Thank you.